Thanks. Hey, let's have a round of applause for everybody from World War II Armor. Is this some event they put on here? I mean, just fantastic. Hey, writing a couple books isn't that easy, but the hard work is when you're running around with this stuff. Okay. All right, so I'm going to spend some time with you talking about the history of the 4th Armored Division, which was the premier armor division not only in Patton's 3rd Army, but I would submit, with all due respect to 2nd Armored, 1st Armored, all the other armor divisions, was the best armor division, the 4th. Now, I am prejudiced, but if anybody wants to debate me about that afterwards, I'm willing to spend a few minutes off to the side. I never served in the military myself. Give you some context, I'm 66. I was just a little too young for the Vietnam era, but I developed an interest in World War II history when I was very young. And I don't know if maybe readers of military history, and you may have a hard time seeing the screen here with the glare, but is anybody familiar with Sir Basil Littlehart, the historian? I see a hand go up over here. So Sir Basil Littlehart was an officer in the First World War. He became the preeminent authority on armored warfare in the early stages. A big proponent of armored warfare, theorist on it, became very well known for it leading up to the Second World War. And his last book, it was published posthumously, was the history of the Second World War. He worked on it for years. And I was 12 years old, I think, at the time, and had begged my parents to join the military book club. She was paid 99 cents. You get a whole bunch of books. You know, I see some kindred spirits out there. Swore that I'd meet the requirement to buy them. Anyway, you got your first 5 picks free, and one of them was Sir Basil Littlehart's book. It's hundreds of pages, quite thick. And my attention, when I read it, was, and you won't be able to read this, but it was drawn to a footnote. I remember it's page, I think it's 557. And my interest was in the campaign from D-Day through the end of the war. That was my main interest. So I thumbed to those chapters right away, and I read this footnote. I won't read it to you, but it's Sir Basil Littlehart talking about a conversation he had with one Major General John S. Wood, who was the commander of the 4th Armored Division, and he had been interviewing Wood before the campaign started, and he had impressed Littlehart as the best armored, I'll call it strategist, had great view of the power of a mobile force, exploitation. It really made an impression upon him, and then as the campaign unfolded, Wood, as you'll hear me talk about, demonstrated those things in action and led the 4th like no other division. So when I read that captivated my interest, and for years I picked up everything I could about 4th Armored. And fast forward to 1999, and I met veterans of the division, 2 prominently. One was Brigadier General Albin F. Erzik, who commanded the 8th Tank Battalion during the war, 27-year-old battalion commander. It was unbelievable the responsibility these guys had at such a young age. I wasn't necessarily that aware of that before I met them, how young at the officer level some of them were. And then the other gentleman was a captain during the war, retired as a colonel, Jimmy Leach. And Jimmy Leach commanded Company B of the 37th Tank Battalion, which was one of the 3 tank battalions within the 4th. And that tank battalion was famous for its accomplishments, but by the fact that it was commanded through most of the campaign by Creighton Abrams, who the M1 tank is named after. So a lot of history there, and it was unbelievable for me meeting these guys. And when I met them, it wasn't with the intent of writing a book. I was hobby farming, it was research, but it was so compelling, I decided to write the book and promised them that I would. And you probably can't see it. This is a picture with Brigadier General Erzik, who lived to 101, passed away in 2018. I think he was 84 when the book came out. Quite an amazing gentleman. So I mentioned Major General John S. Wood's name, and the 4th Armored Division had several commanders during its history, but he was the one that really forged the division. And even after he lost command, I'll come back to this later, he was actually relieved by General Patton in early December of '44, right before the Bulge. Throughout the rest of the war, you talk to anybody in the division, and General John S. Wood was the commander of that division, no matter who actually was in command afterwards. So the history of the 4th starts all the way back in April 15th of 1941 when it was activated. And members of the division came from all over the country. Unlike a lot of National Guard units that were very regional in certain states, armored divisions, because they needed people, in a lot of cases, with more mechanical aptitude. So there were a lot from the Northeast, but many other parts of the country as well. And Brigadier General Baird commanded it first for the first year until Wood was brought in to take command. So they'd already had a year of training under their belt. And they ended up with a total of over 3 years in training. And that made them, prior to their commitment to battle, the division with the longest period of training of all the armored divisions. Interestingly enough, they were the first armored division to go to the new Desert Training Center that was out in California, and never fought in the desert. Ironically, the divisions that did fight in the desert never went to the training center in the desert. So, yeah, that's the Army for you, right, guys? Okay. So, again, you probably can't see it. This is the first book covers the campaign all the way up until the end of the Battle of the Bulge, and here's a map that details the actions. And the Armor Division was formed into 3 what are called combat commands, and they were very fluid and nimble in their organization. So you had Combat Command A, Combat Command B, and Combat Command Reserve. And at any time, the division commander and his staff could divide up the units within the division underneath those combat commands. And it was always flexible. They would change it around depending on the mission. So very, very, a sharp departure from, let's say, World War I and the way things were done. The Germans used some, they called it Kampfgruppen. They used some similar methodology in the way they went about organizing their teams. But I would submit the American Army really mastered that to a much greater degree. So the main components, we had 3 tank battalions. Each tank battalion had 54 medium Sherman tanks plus a company of 17 light tanks. You had then 3 armored infantry battalions, about 1,000 men in each of those battalions, and then 3 field artillery battalions. Each of those battalions had 18 guns, and these were marvelous vehicles. The M7, self-propelled 105 millimeter howitzer. You could move with the division, very, very quick and easy to set up in the field, get ranged, and support a very mobile force in the form of the Armored Division. So the 4th left the United States out of Camp Miles Standish, went over to England right at the end of 1943, arrived in England, continued training in England. They were still in England when D-Day happened, and then finally loaded on ships on July 9th to head over to Normandy. They weren't committed to action until July 17th. And this was a big point of consternation for Major General Wood, because he's expecting, as the leader, commander of an armored division, to be used in exploitation and very fast mobile warfare. But the very first thing he was called on to do by Omar Bradley was to take his armored infantry battalions and put them in the line in Normandy in the hedgerows, and said that one of the reasons was he felt the division should be blooded. Wood was furious. I said, yeah, we've been training 3 years to engage in mobile warfare, armored combat, and you're going to take my prized armored infantry, which is a vital part of it. It's not just about the tanks. It's tanks and infantry, combined armed forces together. And you're going to put my 3,000 armored infantrymen into the line for something they've really even necessarily been trained to do in the same way that I've trained during the last 3 years. And it's unusual for somebody to protest to that degree, especially when you first come into the theater. And that turned out not so well. A lot of casualties. They were attacked after the first day in the line by the, I believe it was the 2nd SS Panzer Division. Took a lot of casualties, and it was a very rough start to the campaign for the armored infantry. But they regrouped from that, and then anybody familiar with Operation Cobra? Ring a bell? Operation Cobra was the main breakout out of Normandy because all the Allied forces were pinned into the Normandy area primarily because of the terrain with the. Okay, I'm going to say this too. If I mispronounce any French, German, or Belgian words, don't shoot me. I am no expert at any of those languages, so I may butcher them. So, when Operation Cobra started, that was the plan to break out of that terrain and into the interior of France. And the 4th Armored Division wasn't involved in the first part of it. That was done by, actually, that was all the 1st Army in the moment. But they were held back in reserve, and they were going to be the exploitation unit. One of 2 armored divisions assigned that role. The other was the 6th Armored Division. So when the day came, just 3-4 days after the start of Operation Cobra, that's when Wood's division was let loose. And actually the 6th Armored Division, too, at the same time. They were going to advance on parallel tracks, going from north to south towards the city of Avranches, which was the gateway into Normandy, and then to the west into the Brittany Peninsula. So if you're familiar with France, and you've got that long peninsula that goes out into the Atlantic, that's the Brittany Peninsula. The importance of the Brittany Peninsula, by the way, was that's where some of the major ports were. Saint-Nazaire, Lorient, Brest, all around the western tip of the peninsula. And the pre-plan for the campaign in France was we have to capture those ports. They're vital for supply. When we're thinking about the plan all the way across France and ultimately into Germany, logistics rule. War is just about as much about logistics as it is anything else. Those ports were deemed necessary. So the original plan was when the 4th Armored, the 6th Armored broke through, they were going to have the mission of turning into Brittany and seizing those ports. Now, Patton, you might say, well, where is Patton in all this? It is Patton's vanguard. Well, it wasn't until August 1st, right after they captured Avranches, which was the gateway into Brittany, that Patton's 3rd Army was activated. They knew that was going to happen, but there needed to be a trigger point. And the trigger point was that day. Patton's 3rd Army became activated, the 4th Armored, the 6th Armored, other divisions became assigned to it, and then Patton had command. Well, one thing nobody expected was that with Operation Cobra, it completely blew open the left flank of the German defenses. And American forces were able to just pour into the interior. Wood, when he was told that he had to continue with a mission of going south and west away from Germany, was furious. His quote, I think I'll get it pretty close to right, was, "We're winning the war the wrong way." And he protested. Patton, actually, at the time, was just willing to go along with the plan. He said, no, you need to go west. In fact, he ended up later criticizing Wood. Because what Wood did was, despite the orders, as he moved south, he turned some of his forces to the east, towards Germany, towards the town of Chateaubriand, southeast of Rennes. So part of their mission was to encircle the city of Rennes, which is right on the eastern side of the Brittany Peninsula, send other units to the west. He snuck a third of his division, moving it to the east. Got in trouble for it, had to pull it all back. So, unfortunately, for a week to 10 days, the 4th Armored Division got all tied up with surrounding these ports. And by the way, some of those ports in Brittany, it turned out they weren't needed. The advance moved so far east so quick that they outran the ports. And some of those ports, a couple of them, remained in German hands throughout the war. We just put forces to contain the ports, and thousands of Germans just stayed within the ports. And they used it for training. Actually, they'd send new divisions in. Say, all right, you go down to Lorient, and you keep those Germans hemmed in, and you'll get some training and some practice down there before we move you over to the main front. So, after Brittany, skip ahead, the leash is let loose, and Wood is able to run eastward towards the German border. And then it was one of the most miraculous armored drives ever. They moved from the city of Nantes, which is at the southern base of the Brittany Peninsula, through the city of Orleans, across the Seine River, to the city of Troyes. And if you're ever studying on it, and there's all this is in great detail in my books, but Troyes became famous for the assault. The Germans had reorganized there. They had a SS brigade, 51st SS brigade, defending the city. The Fourth Armored didn't know there was a brigade there at the time. They knew it was occupied. But one of the combat commands was organized to attack that city and did a classic desert maneuver to attack, because the move into the town was over a very wide open field, several miles wide, and down a descent, down a slope into the city. And they came up with a wide, what they called a desert scattered formation. That way, none of the vehicles, the tanks are too close together, less likelihood of getting hit by fire, artillery fire, and just plunged into this town. Tanks jumping over anti-tank ditches. The training of that division was so superb. In fact, when you talk to veterans of the division when they were here, those early weeks of the campaign, they felt like they were just out on maneuvers. They were, even though now it's real bullets, now they're being fired at, but they were so well honed, and just fought with such great effect. So they had this fantastic display at Troyes. They were complimented by Patton for that attack, and then they continue moving east. They come to the Marne River, and they're coming near the Meuse River, and it's at this point, and if you ever watch the movie, see the movie Patton? Right. You know the scene where they run out of gas? Well, the 4th Armored Division basically runs out of gas. They captured some German stocks here and there, get a few 100,000 gallons. They're able to put that in their tanks and keep rolling. But when they get to the Meuse River, still really well short of Germany, they have to stop. And that stop is very unfortunate, because even though the Germans were in great disarray, their army had been decimated. In fact, behind the 4th Armored, back to the northwest, a great part of the German army had been encircled by the British, Canadian, and armies, and part of the American First Army, and had been decimated, went straggling back to the German border in pieces. But that delay, when logistics stopped them, gave the Germans an opportunity to regroup. And they pulled up units came up from Italy, from in Germany. And one of the advantages Germany had at that point is they were so close to their homeland. So logistically, yeah, they could raise new battalions, panzer battalions. Their manufacturing was still remarkably decent, despite all the air bombardments. In fact, they still produced more tanks than ever at that point in the war, through the summer and into the fall. So they're able to hastily put those together, and despite all the air interdiction by the Allied forces, get them to the battlefield. So when the campaign renews, the 4th Armored then is tasked with crossing the Moselle River, and this is where the city of Nancy is. And another brilliant operation by John Wood. They encircle, one combat command goes north of the city, one goes south. They're going across these river crossings, tanks fording canals. Unheard of. That one of General Erzik's company commanders, the battalions divided into 3 medium tank companies, and won the Distinguished Service Cross, second highest award next to the Medal of Honor, because of his personal fording, taking the lead and pushing his tank and crew across the Moselle. And would have been unthought of to do. And this is all in an area still in enemy territory. So when they cross the Moselle, they encircle Nancy and find more resistance than they thought they were going to eventually. They get near the town of Aricourt. And if you're a student of it, you may know about the great tank battles at Aricourt. And what was about to happen in September was the largest tank versus tank campaign during the war in 1944-45 in Northwest Europe. There were battles on the Russian front that eclipsed it. But as far as the Western front, largest tank versus tank battle. And the 4th Armored, which had advanced across the Moselle and then actually paused and took up some defensive positions across a very thin line, were attacked by several panzer brigades that Hitler personally had ordered, put together, assembled, and then used them to attack. This was at the same time, by the way, that Operation Market Garden was going on. So if you're familiar with the Band of Brothers, let me watch that, and the whole camp when they drop into Holland, all that's going on about the same time there. But while that's going on and the Germans are responding there, they put together all these special panzer brigades, brand new Panther tanks, dozens and dozens of them, factory fresh, but with admittedly very poor crews, ill-trained, pretty new. They've lost a lot of veterans, but still the numbers are very much in their favor. And the German, just as a side note, a lot of times the Sherman tank gets maligned, and that is unfair, because you talk to veterans of the division, they love the Sherman tank, love it. Easy to maintain, great fuel efficiency, not too heavy, bridges can support it. They loved it, and when they knew how to fight it, in other words, when they were well trained, they could defeat German armor, and especially at a time like the Battle of Aricourt. Because one thing that the 4th Armored and Creighton Abrams, because his battalion was engaged the most, the 37th, it was foggy. And the Germans attacked through the fog, so visibility was very low. And that negated the long-range efficiency of the Germans had, because they did have a higher velocity, long-range gun on their Panther tanks, really the Tiger definitely with an 88, and even their Mark IV tank that had a 75 millimeter, same size as a 75 millimeter on a standard Sherman, but much higher velocity. But during that entire morning, when dozens of German tanks are attacking, the American unit is able to navigate through the fog, great radio communications, totally outmaneuver them, hit those tanks in the flank from the rear, and had a kill ratio of 3-4 to 1. So that dozens of Panthers lost, and over several days, the 37th, I think, lost 11 tanks. Another tank, a tank destroyer, which you won't see it in the reenactment today, but it's one of my favorite armored fighting vehicles. It's 3 down, is the M18 Hellcat tank destroyer. It is a superb, fastest armored vehicle in the world until the M1 Abrams tank. And not by much, a few miles per hour. Unbelievable vehicle, high velocity 76 millimeter gun, and that tank destroyer played an incredible role. I was so blessed to be able to interview veterans from the 704th C Company to describe that action. And it's an amazing feat what these guys did. So going back to Aricourt, the Americans score just an outstanding victory in that campaign. Fought mostly defensively and counterattacking, because the general offensive had ground to a halt, really not too far from the German border at that point. But the idea was to wait, regroup, get resupplied, get all the logistics together. And that gave the 4th an opportunity to come off the line. So it was early October, and they turned over their portion of the line to the 26th Infantry Division, relieved them, and then the 4th Armored went back for a much-deserved rest. And typically, throughout the war, at some point, every division gets pulled off the line for some period, absorb replacements, go through additional training, and then get ready to go back into battle. The 4th was then committed in November 11th, and that was the start of the next offensive, Patton's Autumn Offensive, that was intended to then cut into Germany, cross the West Wall. That period of time ended up being the toughest battle. A lot of times you hear about the Battle of the Bulge, and believe me, the 4th Armored had a hell of a time in the Battle of the Bulge. But their casualty rate during this November offensive was the heaviest attrition they took during the war. Lasted a little bit longer in terms of number of days, but it was incredibly heavy fighting. And one of the things that was to their disadvantage was the mud. It was awfully rainy fall that year, and it just bogged down the attack. So they would talk about the attack from an armored standpoint being on a one-tank front. Tanks had to stay to the road, and that was it. It was the tank out front, that was the front. And the Germans were able to play into that. During that campaign, one of the most resounding successes was had by Al Erzik. I mean, he was a 27-year-old tank battalion commander, 8th Tank Battalion at the time, and he's leading a advance toward a town called Mart Hill. And so if you can envision this, it's going down a road, and there's a high set of hills off to his left, and the town of Mart Hill is straight down the road and a little bit to the right. Now, given the terrain conditions, it would have been, okay, keep going down the road. But he had a feeling, he just described it to me, I had this sixth battle sense, and something just told me that was not going to turn out well. So he looked at that slope going up the hill, and it was all clear, a little bit of brush. He thought, you know, it's risky, maybe a little too muddy, but I think I can send a few platoons of tanks up that hill. And he led with his light tanks. I don't know if we have a Stuart light tank here. I haven't seen one. But the M5 light tank, much about half the weight of a Sherman tank. So he led with his light tank platoon, a light tank platoon. So let's send up to the heights, advance down the crest. We'll be able to see down and then fire into the town and lend support as the rest of the command goes down the road. So they start up the hill, and as they're advancing, they do what's I may butcher the term, but advance by fire, or recon by fire. So without spotting anything, they're just with the 50 cals, the 30 cal machine guns, they're just opening up along a wood line that's on the top, just in anticipation that something may be there. And as they're firing down the wood line, they see, oh, we're hitting something, and they see some marks and then some glints of light. And it turned out that the Germans had positioned a couple of batteries of anti-tank guns up on the crest of that hill in anticipation of firing down on anybody advancing down the road. All their guns were pointed that way. They could not turn them anywhere in enough time to aim at the American tanks coming down the crest. And so those advancing tanks, both the light tanks and then joined by the Sherman tanks, just fired on them. And not all those German tanks were manned at the time, because all of a sudden what they see is dozens of German troops running out of the town of Marthill, trying to go up the slope to get to the anti-tank gun positions. They weren't fully manned. So it was a resounding victory in that event. And then they were able to advance in the town. It was no contest after that. Well, that was and very light casualties for the American forces in that instance. But that was not typical of this November campaign. Very, very tough fighting. Now, as the advance is moving forward, Wood, still the commander of the division at that point, sees that the going is tough, the road conditions are bad, but he's doing his map study, and he sees that, boy, there are some better roads to my east. And his destiny, ultimately, his objective is the city of Saarburg, close to the German border, and then going into Germany near Singling and Beining, some other small towns there. So, on his own, well, let me back up. The problem with where those good roads are, they are in the zone of the 7th Army, U.S. 7th Army, which is fighting adjacent. And it's very strict. You have a zone that you're supposed to be fighting and advancing, and you do not go outside of those zones certainly without any coordination. Well, he goes actually to the corps commander that he's fighting next to. He knows from his West Point days, and he works out on his own to get permission to cross over into the 7th Army zone. And Mantonetti, his corps commander, he's already had some issues with, doesn't like this. He is pretty upset about it. But it ends up being a brilliant move. And he moves over into this zone, and I'll say probably overstays his welcome in the zone of the 7th Army. So it becomes a bit of a pissing match between them. Mantonetti calls him in, and if General Wood were still with us today, I think he would acknowledge that he was insubordinate, which is not a good thing to do, no matter how accomplished you are. And that altercation led to Mantonetti going to Patton. And Patton and Wood, by the way, were very close, if not best friends. They were at West Point together, both students of armor and very tight. But Mantonetti had enough, goes to Patton, and says, look, he cannot be under my command anymore. I want him relieved. And Patton relieved him. And if you read some material a little bit older, written decades ago, we'll talk about, well, Wood was battle fatigued. And one thing about Wood, he suffered the deprivations of his soldiers. That made him distinctly different as a commander. He didn't stay in billets, in fancy places that he could, where they'd set up headquarters. He went the whole campaign, he was leading out of a tent, in muddy fields, surrounded by his troops, admonished about that sometimes. In fact, the one time General Spatz, who was over the Army Air Force, gifted him a command trailer earlier in the campaign. Wood had one photo taken in the doorway of it, and they never used it. Because he said, I can't set this kind of example when my men are going through this kind of hardship. So he did lead in a way that could have made him more susceptible to fatigue, but that wasn't the case. That was basically a favor and a cover story to Wood. And he was much to his disgust, and he was sent home, then became the commander of the training armor at Fort Knox during the balance of the war. So a new commander comes in, and Hugh Gaffey, who was Patton's chief of staff. So the 4th Armored was so important to the performance of the Army that he took his number 2 and put him in command of the division. He'd also commanded the 2nd Armored Division during North Africa and Sicily, so he had experience as a division commander. And just a couple days, this was December 3rd or 4th, that Wood was relieved, the 4th Armored finally comes off the line and gets a rest period, now with a new division commander. And then comes the Battle of the Bulge. So, anybody know what date the Battle of the Bulge started? December 16th. Okay. December 16th, 1944. Biggest battle for American forces of the Second World War in terms of troops engaged in any single defined battle of that sort. 4th Armored Division was 160 miles to the south of where the Germans attacked through the American lines into what's called the Ardennes Forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. Totally shocked the American forces. Patton was just getting ready to renew his offensive. He had started that one offensive back on November 11th, but now he had taken a break, and they were reorganizing and getting ready to attack through the West Wall, which was the German defenses on the border. In fact, when the news came during those first couple of days about this German attack, because you've got to realize the intel was very light, trying to figure out what's going on, and Patton was blowing it off. He didn't want to be disrupted from his offensive. He's been planning this, to launch this. I think it was going to be December 19th, if I recall, was going to be the day that attack was going to start. And now he's being asked to divert his troops to go counterattack against the Germans. So at first he somewhat reluctantly said, and the 4th Armored Division ended up being the 2nd unit dispatched to go up. The first one was the 10th Armored Division, which didn't go to counterattack. It rushed just to help save Bastogne, which is, again, if you've seen Band of Brothers, that's where the 101st Airborne was encircled. So you got the 101st Airborne, you've got a 1/3 of the 10th Armored Division is encircled in there, and a variety of other units. So the 4th Armored Division is then pulled, they were in rest. They had to drive straight, go by road miles, 160 miles, which is a lot to put these armored vehicles on the road, straight through winter conditions. Wear and tear on engines, treads, it's not a thing that would typically be done. And the 4th Armored Division led that magnificent, it's called the 90-degree turn, to go up to the Bulge, and then immediately started their attack. So the 4th Armored, the Combat Command B, which included Al Erzik's 8th Tank Battalion, was actually the first element to arrive there. And a little known piece of history is they left first, ahead of the rest of the division, and had moved free of any interference from the Germans within about 4 miles of Bastogne, and stopped there. They were ordered to stop there. And then there was some confusion in the command structure. So much was happening. And Al Erzik, who was commanding that task force, was instructed to send a small task force into Bastogne. It hadn't been encircled yet. So he sent a company of tanks commanded by Len Kiley, and I knew Len and participated with me in my second book, a lot of interviews for that book. He led a tank company, there was a company of armored infantry, and one battery, 6 of these M7 howitzers. And they were sent and went into Bastogne. And when they got there, it was so confusing. They didn't know what was going on. The defenders of Bastogne, the commander of the 101st Airborne Division, had no idea why they were there, why they were sent there. He didn't get any info, didn't know how to deploy them. In the meantime, Patton ended up hearing that part of the 4th Armored Division had been sent into Bastogne and was now out of his command. Now he's under the 8th Corps, which is still under 1st Army, and he's pissed. He goes, wait a minute, they got to come back. So that task force is pulled out, and then Al Erzik's entire combat command, which was in 4 miles of Bastogne, then pulls back some 15 miles. And in that gap of time, the Germans came through, cut across right through that area where they had been. And it's the quandary sometimes, the quirks of fate. Had they not been pulled back and they'd been in that spot, it would have been in the direct line of the pincer that was coming around to encircle Bastogne from the south. And who knows how that would have turned out. Yeah, Al Erzik, when he was talking to me about it, was just never would stop thinking about it. But here you have 4th Armored Division now has that combat command pulled up. The rest of the combat commands come into position, and now they're ready to start a coordinated attack. But by this time, the Germans have now strung out defensive positions all across the south flank of the Bulge. And now the 4th Armored is in the fight of its life to try to break through to Bastogne. So that attack gets going in earnest on December 22nd. And it takes 4 days of just brutal slugging to make its way into Bastogne. And the final assault was done by the 37th Tank Battalion, and it was the lead tank in the assault. It was called Cobra King. And I encourage you, if you ever have the opportunity, if you're in the Washington, D.C. area, go visit the National Army Museum, which opened right at the start of the pandemic. I'm on the board of the Historical Foundation, because that tank, not the type of tank, the tank Cobra King, that exact tank is the centerpiece display at that museum. It's magnificent, and it's amazing that it survived the war. It ended up, after the war, it had been actually knocked out in combat at one point, but then used as a museum display, in a static tank in front of other bases. So amazing that it was rescued. So I'm going to fast forward a bit, because I've got a tendency to give a lot of detail. But there's one story I want to end with. How are we doing on time?
You're a little tight.
Okay, one quick story. That involves Cobra King. Task Force Bomb. So I encourage you in my second book, I devote 3 chapters to this. Patton, in late March, the war's come within 6 weeks of ending, and he instructs the 4th Armored Division to put together a task force to go liberate a prisoner of war camp 45 miles behind enemy lines. 300 men on the task force, commanded by Abe Baum, who I had the honor of knowing and interviewing. They break through, they actually make their way to the prison camp, suffer casualties along the way, lose vehicles, lose men, break into the camp, find out there are far more prisoners there than they can carry back. They had bad intelligence. But what they don't know is the real reason they've been sent on the mission is because General Patton's son-in-law is held prisoner there. So, if you find that intriguing, I'd encourage you to read it in the book. I'd give you more history, but I am being given the hook. So, thanks for being here. And I'll be selling and signing books if you're interested. They're $39 a piece. There's 2 volumes for them. And I'll be hanging out for a while to do that. So thank you very much.
Give it up for Don Fox.